and I know we're beyond this, but I just want to review just a couple. Yeah, okay, I'm good. I just wanted to review a couple of things. So this section 3 talks about what Attenborough's been talking about a little bit. How do you get separate species? How do you get different species, okay? We've been talking a lot about natural selection, the environment selecting. And yeah, for them that, yes, but there are reasons within environments and within species that it can differentiate as well, and I'm going to kind of go through that. The big thing is we're dealing with genetics, so remember that. So an allele showing up more prominently, okay, than another allele can become an adaptation or a behavior eventually can cause a different population, or two populations of the same species would not reproduce together because of different behaviors, and we'll go through that. Okay, so the first thing is letter D. We've already written survival and reproduction may be limited by chance or the way that genes work. I hope that you highlighted that or wrote that in there. I hope that you did that. The first behavior, the first thing that we look at as far as causing perhaps a separate species over millions of years would be natural selection. And we kind of looked at that a little bit, where you can have an increase or decrease in a certain allele within a population. Over a long period of time, it may become an adaptation. Okay, so that's one way that you can end up with a separate species or a different species, like maybe with those finches, some of those tortoises that we've seen on that Galapagos video. So I would write beside natural selection number 1, way number 1. The second way is migration. So once in a while, you will see migration playing a role in introducing alleles into a population or taking out an allele. And if it stays that way, over time, you may end up with a separate species. That usually goes hand in hand with natural selection. So migration can change a way that change the numbers of alleles in a population, change the type of alleles in a population. So if they're trying to look for a different food source or something like that, you might see that. So there's my little picture on migration. They're moving. All right, mate choice is another way as well. So if this is non-random, we call this non-random mating, and you'll see a little clip actually in the next chapter. But sometimes you just have random mating, doesn't matter. But you can also have non-random mating where there's a choice. And you see that a lot with birds, like your cardinals. The peacocks have the large tails, and their bright color can indicate health. So the females aren't brightly colored because they're not being picked. They're doing the picking. So the male cardinal is one good example. Like I said, the peacocks. But if it's non-random and you don't get picked, your alleles are not going to be passed on. So eventually, those alleles could go by the wayside if they never get picked. There's a good example I'll show you with the weaver birds that is mate choice. So here's an example, the plumage here, this little bird looking on, trying to decide. That's mate choice. Oh, yeah, I picked that one too, the little cardinal, female and male cardinal, mate choice. So I just saw the female and male out in my yard. I think it was on Monday. I was talking to their mothers. Oh, there they are, out in my yard. They're pretty. So parents are limited or selective in their choice of mates. You're going to pass on a limited set of traits, and eventually you could end up with a population that is differentiated enough that may not mate with other populations of the same species. That's pretty rare, but it could happen. So mate choice, I would highlight that. So all of these are different ways in which you can get a different species. Mutation is what we saw the other day on that modeling natural selection. Mutation is just, it's a difference. It's a change. It's a spontaneous change. So mutation is a spontaneous change, and it can change the numbers or types of alleles within a population. So it can change from one generation to the next. If that allele is non-harmful or if it's helpful, you might see that being passed on. So like, for example, that little modeling natural selection, we had a mutation. The red were mutated. So those were the same species. You had two different populations. That one population that was able to breed in the higher numbers did not mix with the other one. So eventually, if you have a mutation that's working in one population, it may end up differentiating that population enough. So an example of mutation, this is a famous example, it's the peppered moth. And they have them on, so you can see them, on leaves so you can see them. And originally, you had moths that were this color, peppered. And they would blend in to trees that were covered in lichens, this same color. There was a mutation of moth, a recessive, that had a darker color. Well, this one blended into the trees. This recessive, this mutation here, did not, and therefore it would get eaten by birds. You had the advent of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution happened first in England and then came on over to the United States. And it was helpful with industry, but it also caused some problems. One of the problems was a lot of pollution. Coal was a primary fuel. Probably, I don't know if you ever burned with coal. Back home in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of coal. And so my grandfather burned with coal. And because it's very cheap. A lot of people still burn with coal today because it's really cheap. But he would go down, stoke the coal furnace. I remember going down with him, doing all of that. And in the springtime, about now, maybe in May, when the furnace, we put with the furnace, I remember my grandmother spring cleaning. You wipe down all of the walls, and those walls would be black with coal dust, soot. That's what happened. You had forests outside of England, outside of London, and that's where these pepper moths lived. And the trees got covered in that soot. Lichens died. Now, what you're seeing, the birds can see these quite easily now. They're standing out. This mutation, this recessive, is blending in. So today, the pepper moth are more of a darker color. We still have some of the other ones, but they're more of a darker color. Natural selection and mutation working together. Genetic drift, so highlight, all of these highlight. Genetic drift is another one, and that's just a random occurrence, everyday events. There's no rhyme nor reason why an allele drops out. Highlight that it's a small population. And I will show you a picture that will illustrate this a lot easier than what I can explain it. So highlight what genetic drift is, highlight that it's a small population that this happens in. All right, so I'm going to show you what we mean by this. So here's a small population of beetles. You have two different colors. You have one that is probably the dominant, which is the brown, and then you have the recessive green, okay? We're not talking mutation, it's just two different ways that these beetles can look as far as coloration. Population, in this population of beetles, I have 9. Is that a large population of beetles? No, very small. Genetic drift happens. What does that mean? An accident, happenstance. Person comes along in this little colony of beetles. I don't know what you call them. I'm going to say colony. On this little colony of beetles, 9 of them, and steps on 2 of them. They happen to be the green ones that this person steps on. So takes out 2 green. Now I'm left with 6 brown and 1 green. So do you think that's going to change the allele numbers? Do you think I'm going to end up with even more brown than what I had before? Absolutely I will. That's genetic drift. There's no natural selection going on. It's just a happenstance, it's an accident, small population took out some, especially the recessive allele or the allele that you're not seeing a whole lot. That's all genetic drift is. Coevolution is what we're going to look at today. Organisms of one part of another's environment, and they can affect their adaptation together. So if they're living in close contact with each other, they may have clear adaptations. You might see some adaptations. Birds and flowers, a lot you see that. Or like insects and flowers, you see that a lot. Flowers usually need the insects or the birds for pollinating. The insects or the birds need them for food, a food source. Here's a very good example, and I cannot remember what this bird's name is, but this trumpet flower and this bird's beak adapting for this flower works perfectly for it, and I don't know what the bird's name is. Yeah?
I feel bad for that little thing. Never go into a small little pipe.
Nope. So, anyway, and there's probably not a lot of birds that can fit, so this would fit in there. So therefore, probably he's got a food source unto himself, really. So that's an example. Adaptive radiation, this is what that fossil activity was when you looked at that. So sometimes a species may split into two different lines. And we call those lineages. And as it repeats, it might give rise to a new species. Or, like what we saw, might end up going extinct, too. So like the famous one, I'm going to ask you that. The famous one is the Galapagos finches on adaptive radiation. They're the ones that started, they feel, and then a central, and then you've got lineages that radiated out from that, dealing with the beak. Extinction, all of the lineage dies off, fails to reproduce. You can only call something extinct when it's complete. So, like on that video that we're looking at, Lonesome George, could not call that particular tortoise extinct until George died. And then he's extinct. Even if you know you've got the last one, can't call it extinct. And highlight that. So you might get speciation occurring. You might end up getting speciation occurring, but it may go extinct too. I mean, you might get a lineage radiating off and maybe being considered a separate species, but that line may go extinct. Then the last two, graduated equilibrium. Highlight this. Whatever you have to write, highlight it all. I'm going to ask you this. This is what Lyell and Hutton said. That you might end up with a new species, but it might be small changes over a long period of time that may build up. And if the population in which that change is taking place is not mixing with any other populations of that species, then you might end up with a new species. And this is what Darwin had gone with too. Last one, highlight that one as well, punctuated equilibrium, and that new species suddenly appear. Actually, probably highlight the whole thing, but punctuate like sudden. So some biologists said no. And this is what I think Cuvier said that species don't change minutely over time, that they remain very stable, and then something happens in the environment, maybe a catastrophe, a sudden climate change, what have you, and you end up with new pressures, environmental changes, new pressures, and you get these new species suddenly appearing. I would highlight that. So punctuate sudden. Usually we don't go with that. It's usually more graduated, gradually, small. All right, so let's put those things away. When did you get them? Right. Watch your eyes. It's going to be a bumpy ride for your eyes.
Oh my gosh.
All right, so the next thing I want to do is this co-adaptation, and I'm going to put you in a group of 3. I'm going to